Based on what you've been able to read and go over, what does this mean?
Well, this leak is an outrage, and it's going to cause incalculable damage to American diplomatic efforts around the world. People who talk to American diplomats typically do so on the assumption that what they say will be held confidential. And now reading some of these conversations in the world's major newspapers is simply going to dry up the flow of information.
Give me an example. How would it damage, say, our relationship with Saudi Arabia, or what we're trying to talk the Iranians into doing or not doing? Give me an example.
Well, that's a good case study. People have known for a long time that the Arab states don't want Iran to have a nuclear weapons program. It's perfectly obvious from basic strategic analysis. But that's a far different cry from seeing King Abdullah being reported in a State Department cable saying just that. From what you can see of the reaction already, we will simply not get that kind of important insight into the thinking of foreign governments. And that was exactly what Wikileaks' intent was here. This is an anti-American organization. It's intended to impair America's abilities to protect its interests around the world, and we ought to treat it exactly that way.
To that point, Mr. Ambassador, has Wikileaks been successful?
Yes, no question about it. And I think it's time for us to stop being a well-bred doormat here. I think any American who was involved in leaking this information to WikiLeaks ought to be charged with treason, because that's what they've done. Make no mistake about it. And they ought to get the fullest extent of the law thrown against them that's possible, number one. And number two, I think America's cyber warfare capabilities need practice, and I think they ought to practice on WikiLeaks.
This 23-year-old private, I believe, in the U.S. Army, he's the one now being held. Manning is his last name.
Well, whoever it is,
in Virginia, he's the one responsible for all of this. He had the access.
You know, it boggles my mind to think that one person could have done this, and I'm sure there's more investigation. But I'd say this: not only should he be prosecuted fully as the person who, or whoever engaged in this leakage, but any contractor, any federal contractor, any officer in the chain of command that allowed this circumstance to happen, that violated the procedures to prevent the downloading of this kind of information, all ought to be fired. The contractors ought to be debarred from federal contracts as far as the eye can see. Now, we really need a strong response.
To that extent, though, there's a paper trail that's obvious. It's just a matter of carrying out the investigation.
Well, I hope the investigation is well underway. This Private Manning's been in solitary confinement for 7 months. I hope they've figured out what the story is. You know, Secretary Gates hasn't been afraid to fire generals. The Walter Reed scandal is an example. I think people need to be fired here. We need to have examples of what happens when you commit this kind of crime.